Estamos numa encruzilhada e o desafio é manter a rede de proteção social sem levar os países à falência. Há quem afirme que a solução é mais proteção do Estado. Outros defendem que haveria mais saúde e prosperidade se o mercado funcionasse livremente. Como sair desse dilema? Talvez a resposta esteja além das finanças e da política. As inovações tecnológicas que aproximaram o mundo acentuaram o individualismo, transformaram nossa relação com o tempo e tornaram o consumo o principal foco da economia. Alguns sugerem que um passo necessário para começarmos a melhorar nossa realidade está em repensar a forma como entendemos o trabalho. Esta é uma das propostas de Richard Sennet, escritor e professor de Oxford e da New York University, autor de uma dúzia de livros. Ele dedicou os últimos 16 anos ao estudo do capitalismo moderno e vê no Brasil uma das maiores esperanças para o futuro do mundo. Este homem renascentista tem um vasto universo que vai da cozinha, onde é um chefe de pratos sofisticados, passando pela metafísica e pela música, seu primeiro talento. Vive entre o Reino Unido e os Estados Unidos e falou conosco no estúdio do Milênio, em Nova York. Professor Sennett, thank you again for coming here.
Thank you
We
for
appreciate. You tell some wonderful stories on the craftsmen. One about the most famous goldsmith during the Renaissance, Cellini. And the other about Antonio Stradivari.
Yeah.
How do you connect this great craftsman to the 21st century?
Well, what both of them were doing was trying to make something that could be things that could be copied, but not quite to the level where they were genius. But they weren't what we think about as modern artists, you know, who make something and it's one of a kind. And Stradivarius thought that he'd invented a new sort of way of making cellos and violins that others could imitate. Of course, they'd never be as good as he was, but that he had set the standard of quality. And a lot of craftsmanship has that. It's very competitive, all craftsmen competitive with each other. But what they share in common is the notion that there's an objective standard of good quality. And unlike modern artists, they want other people to follow that standard that they set. So that is a connection, I think, to a way we should be thinking about making things well, making things quality today. Not to make something that's unique, but something that can be made by others, can be shared with others at a very good level.
Professor, 10,000 hours. That's the number you gave to produce a craftsman.
Yeah, I'll explain.
Where do you get this 10,000 hours? And I think, is there a craftsman inside all of us?
You have it too. You are a craftsman. I'll tell you what this number represents. In order to learn how to do something well and reliably, we have to do it over and over again. When I was a musician, we had to practice 3 or 4 hours every day. People in sports, the same thing. You can by accident do something well, but to do it well, you have to ingrain the knowledge of it in you as a tacit thing, something you don't have to think about. And this famous number that I came up with, it may be 10,500 and maybe 9,999, is what my assistants and I, when we were doing the research on this, estimate how long it takes to do two things. First, to have this set of, you know what you're doing because you've done it enough time that it's ingrained in you without thinking. And second, to have many ways, to learn how to do many ways to solve the same problem. And this is an important thing in craftsmanship. If you think there's only one way to do something, you tend to become very monotonous. You don't know how to change or improve. Whereas if you learn 5 different ways to hammer a nail, or 5 different ways to cooperate with somebody who is also your competitor, then you are more skilled. You have more solutions to a problem. And the result of that is that you can weigh these different ways of doing something and gradually choose and improve the best. So what this number represents is experience and diversity of knowledge. So as I say, it's not exactly 10,000.
No, right. But it's a lot of hours.
Well, what it is, if you think about it...
Figure out how many years is that?
I can tell you exactly. To produce a first level soccer player, football player, as you would say, is parallel to producing a musician who can play in an orchestra. That is 3.5 hours to 5 hours of practice every day for 7 years.
Yeah, that's really sharp.
So, I mean, it's very precise.
You wrote that modern society removes people's skills.
Yeah.
How and why?
Well, it has done this by 2 means. One was the way in which industrialization proceeded. But the less obvious is what happened as the so-called skills society of services came into being. And what I've tried to show in my books is that actually this service society has de-skilled lots of people who had face-to-face skills in providing service and made it a more tailorite, that is, more standardized sets of procedures. You can't go into a global chain of shops, for instance, and bargain about the price of what you're buying. You know, you can't do that. We're seeing in medical practice now that what nurses are allowed to do and not do is very standardized. And it's a real issue that unless we're not careful with this third revolution, which is this electronic revolution, that the machines could become another element in de-skilling people. Now, I don't think they need to be, and the fact that the machine, once you get out of the kind of monoliths of Microsoft or Google, and you learn a programming language like Linux, which is an open source language, there are ways to use these machines just as flexibly and individually as hand tools were used. But we need to want to do that in order to avoid the machines becoming a kind of ultimate degradation of the service economy.
You wrote a trilogy. The first book is Craftsman. And you called it Homo Faber.
Yeah.
So why did you write the trilogy? Why do you call it Homo Faber?
Well, let me answer your second question first.
Some people don't know what Homo Faber is.
Homo Faber means man as maker. And what I have been interested in all my life is how things are made, rather than, I'm not very much interested in how things are consumed, you know? I'm very Puritan. But I like making things. And I had an intuition that there was a common set of practices to make things well, to pursue good quality, that moves from handwork to making social relations, to making the environment. And this trilogy looks at the skills people need to develop to do things well in making things, social relations, and places. So that's the architecture
Right.
of this whole.
But why the craftsman is so meaningful and so important?
Well, I think it's so because in the second industrial age, that is of the 20th century, a lot of the things we made were monotonous and of poor quality. You have only to look at housing after the Second World War, you know? It's very poorly done. The
I
attention
think you mentioned, especially, you tell a long story about Russia,
yeah.
the construction.
Well, this was an amazing experience to me. I went to Russia to be shown workers' housing. And you know how these trips, these official trips are? It's a little Potemkin village, you know what I mean? And I had a real Russian guide. That is somebody who, at the same time that she was telling me how wonderful everything was being incredibly ironic. And as we went from one of these ideal workers' housing to another, she'd go things like, look at the windows. The windows were falling out of their frames. Or she'd open the door to something I wasn't supposed to see. You saw this garbage piled up. And I had a wonderful talk with her and then with other people in what was then the Soviet Union about why it is that communism, which was dedicated to bringing things of good quality to the masses, had produced such poor quality stuff. And it wasn't just a lack of money, it was also a mentality about industrial workmanship and the distance that these workers felt in the workers' paradise from engagement in their work.
So there was a lack of motivation on this.
Yeah. That's not so far different than what you can find that elsewhere. But it was very striking to me because I was there to be shown this paradise.
Your book together tell us that cooperation is essential to make our lives better. But this cooperation is not something new.
No, hardly.
So what's this cooperation you are talking about? How is it different than the old cooperation?
Well, what I'm talking about in this book, what I'm exploring, is a complex cooperation. How do we cooperate with, and by cooperation I mean working with other people to do things you can't do yourself. How do we cooperate in that sense with people we don't know, who are strangers, people we don't like, or people with whom we're also competing? It's a very complex kind of cooperation. It requires skills which we don't have naturally fully developed. We need to learn to develop them. And the model for me in this book that I've used is, is twofold. One of them, in the practical world, has been, what does cooperation look like in a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-class city, religious city? And in my head, what I have been thinking about for myself is a kind of cooperation that goes on when musicians play music together. We do different things. Musicians are not sweet. We are a dreadfully childish, combative, unruly group. How is it we can do these different things together and want to make it work? And so I've been interested in things like, how do musicians learn to rehearse? How do young hotshots who play without listening to other people, play like the devil, how do they come to pay attention to what other people are doing? How is the egoism tamed? And that's been in my head about this, in a lot of my sociology, I've drawn on experiences I've had in musician as a kind of social model. But the practical thing for me has been, what makes a city, complex city, work? Get people isolated in themselves, guarded communities, high fences, the Alsatians barking at the gates, all of that sort of stuff. And you know this well in Sao Paulo. And question is, are we condemned to live in these kinds of, everybody is imprisoned that way. And I think we need to do more experimenting in how to convert those walls, not into something where everything is thrown open, but there's more chance of encountering people who are different by class or race or ethnicity or religion from the people who are familiar to you. And a lot of the work I've done on cities is about how to do that in public space.
You said that you had an intuition, a feeling about the present economic crisis. Much earlier, before the crisis began, when did you have this intuition?
I had it, I don't want to boast about this, that I saw it coming, okay. But I went to Davos in 1996, and I think again in 1997, but certainly in 1996. And as I saw these, you know, this is this World Economic Forum, these powerful men sitting in corners with coffee, saying, why are we arguing about $1 billion, you know, and making a deal? And as I saw this happening, I thought this will not last. These people are the only reality principle they have.
So it was at Davos?
At Davos. The only reality principle they have is this other billionaire in front of them. They don't talk about their firms, their employees. They talk about, you know, buying and selling, getting in, getting out. The politicians, this was the height of the neoliberal era. The politicians thought that these people were gurus, that the head of an investment bank was fit to pronounce on the state of a country's education or their old age pensions, that they were the reality principle, these gurus. And it was clear to me that they were much too narrow people to ever serve as a reality principle. So 10 years later, we know what happened.
So it was 10 years before?
10 years before.
Whoa,
As they say, don't boast about this. And it was just an intuition I had watching the way these men talked. There was no reality except the reality of your billion versus my billion. It wasn't a real world they were talking about.
In one of your lectures, you said you have spent the last 15, 16 years of your life studying modern capitalism.
Right. I'm so glad you asked me this.
Why is it worse than old capitalism?
It's not worse, it's different.
How?
It's different. It's well, for many reasons. It's more global, obviously. But the time frame of this capitalism is time is configured totally different than it was in the past. The firms that people work for are more unstable. They don't have a corporate identity, which is fixed over a long period of time. The kinds of work people do is very short term, and the relationship between the worker and the firm is very weak. There are very weak bonds on both sides connecting them. It's the replacement of something that we used to call social capitalism, corporate capital, social capitalism, with something which is at once much more fluid and much more individualized for the worker. And we started this conversation by talking about inequality. Inequality profits from this short-term time. It's how investment now proceeds. It's in short-term return rather than long-term profit. It's also a way of not taking responsibility for the fortunes of a firm, all this sort of thing. So that what people are experiencing is a work world which is far more fragmented than the work world of our parents or grandparents. The whole relations between social classes is transformed by that. You don't have class conflict in the way you had in America or Britain in the middle of the 20th century, where there's a body of workers fighting a managerial class that's defending itself. The body of workers is constantly changing. The managerial class itself is constantly shifting and disappearing. The corporate entity itself is a network of bits and pieces, kind of archipelago, if you like, of activities rather than having a whole. There's nothing to fight, to punch against. So what's happened in these conditions is the people who benefit from that are at the very top of the structure, the elite. And below that, you have stagnation. You have stagnation in terms of the wages people, the wealth that people get from it, and you also have a stagnant social situation where people do not bond at work, where they're not connected to other workers. Class consciousness diminishes. Since you and I are good Marxists, we want class consciousness.
You are a socialist.
You understand what I'm saying, do you?
Yeah.
This is a huge change in capitalism that we've gone through in the last 25 years, as great as during the first Industrial Revolution. But I am a socialist.
You are a socialist. What does it mean to be a socialist today? What do you guys do?
Gather in dark basements, smoke a lot of cigarettes.
What kind of conspirations?
Conspirators. Well, I give you a serious answer to that for me, and it's what this book on cooperation is about, because it's really a political book. I think we have to... Let me answer your question this way. At the beginning of the 20th century, there was a huge divide in European socialism between what is called the social left and the political left. The social left was community organizations, local banks, work from the bottom up. The political left, this is before Lenin, was very top-down, large unions, formal political parties, that sort of direction in which the masses followed. And for most of the 20th century, for good and mostly for ill, the political left dominated. That is, it's a structure for mobilizing bureaucratic power from the top down in the name of justice. Now I think we're today at a turning where, given the nature of capitalism, what we need to do on the left is rebuild the social from the bottom up. And the reason I'm interested in this complex form of cooperation is that when people get its skills, they're able across, in a community or a city, across these boundaries of class and race and so on, to begin to cooperate with each other. I've always been sickened by politicians. It's a kind of seduction or moralizing in the name of the people, which I dislike. And so that's a prejudice of mine and a blindness of mine. But I do think that today what we need to do is build institutions of the left up from the bottom.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much for asking.
Se você quer saber mais, vá no nosso site no Milênio. Muito obrigado.